to start the conversation, I think what I'd love to really kind of tap into is this interdisciplinary collaboration. And Kristine, you are over at Fuseproject, which Fuse, by its very name, fuses the various disciplines of industrial design and digital and graphic design and branding all together in the one house. And I don't believe anyone in this room can argue that they haven't been wildly successful with that model. And so the question I'll ask you, Kristine, is, in the years that you've been there, which I think is now coming up on 5, right? How do you feel like, how has this model been so successful? What about Fuse's approach has gotten us to work? And what advice maybe do you have for other agencies or even individuals who are looking to go into uncharted territory and expand their offerings?
That's a good question.
Is your mic on?
Is it?
No, maybe.
Yeah?
You want to try this one?
Okay.
You want to swap? Here, take mine.
No, they said it's on. Yeah?
Try it.
Is it on? I'm just that loud.
You don't even need a mic.
I don't need a mic. Well, I think it's complicated. I think it's not an easy task, but I think one of the things that we do really successfully is it's not just about specialties, even though we have specialties in their disciplines. It's also about the mix of hybrids within them.
Right.
And one of the things that we do is create a collaborative team around every project that we kick off. And in doing so, you're getting different perspectives from each discipline. You're getting different perspectives from people's life experiences. And having each of them be part of that, both the research, the immersion, and then also the design, helps to bring a different story to each idea. But I think that it's an interesting problem because I see a lot of that coming through depending on what the project is. We'll get projects that are solely industrial design and we'll still have people, I guess I should start off by saying we have a really open studio.
Mm-hmm.
So even if it's a closed project, as in like not brand needed or it doesn't need UX or UI, we're still there looking around and we're like, oh, what are you working on over there? Oh yeah, that looks like shit. You should do this. Did you think about that? Or, and I think that the ideas and the opinions of other people coming around and actually being open to collaboration and open to being investigated by others is what really makes Fuse Fuse. I think it's kind of invasive in a way, but in a good way where if you're open to it, you can actually learn a lot from the people around you. And if you take a moment to let them look at your work instead of guard it, you can actually make it something that's much more improved. So I would say it's not just about the collaboration, it's also about the openness of learning and listening to other people's ideas.
Almost like this celebration of transparency.
Completely, yeah. It's very scary sometimes, but I'm completely used to it now.
Which, to your point, ties totally into the physical space, because you've got this really beautiful open environment, there's no walls, there's the whole cubicle notion is completely broken down. And there's even people skateboarding throughout. It's just a real kind of, yeah, exactly.
You were there.
I know, I have a little bit of insider.
Yeah.
I was there for 3 years. So kind of following up on that, when we think about, this interdisciplinary collaboration, Graham, you're over at CCA teaching interaction design, and CCA is just incredible at having all these wonderful offerings from graphic design, industrial design, et cetera. It kind of goes on, and they do, I think, from my perspective, all of them quite well. And so you design classes where you try to hopefully, connect students in interaction design into the industrial design space. So they're thinking beyond the screen. They're working with materials that are maybe beyond the traditional tools of an interaction designer. So how do you kind of help facilitate that conversation and maybe encourage students to go out of their comfort zones and kind of peer over the cliff, so to speak, into these areas that are maybe unfamiliar to them as they're so young in their careers?
I was just admiring the title, actually. It's very Star Trek in a way, designing beyond the screen to boldly go. I've taught on 2 different programs, the MFA and the MDes program, so fine arts and design. And I found that the way collaborations really happen at CCA is usually from the bottom up. So it's the students and the professors that really want these cross sort of discipline partnerships to happen. And maybe that's the way it should happen too. That's maybe the most productive way of doing it. But the classes that I teach actually with a couple of co-teachers who are in the audience here are sort of biased towards non-screen based interactivity. So tangible media, stuff where we're no longer necessarily just using touch screens, we're thinking about how people move through space and time, which is the Star Trek part, I guess, of this, right? And how we can sort of start to design a new language of interaction where we're not, which is this beyond the realm part, I guess, in which people can, because part of the problem is like designing interactions that can be understood globally. We can't rely on old metaphors, right? So the challenge is to design these, I think, new platforms, and this is where we need different disciplines to collaborate. So people that are used to working on screen need to work with people that understand space more. To me, there's like a great affinity between interaction design and architecture.
Exactly.
Right?
Yep.
That seems to me like a really good place to have a relationship. And actually, there's one of the most interesting cross-departmental collaborations recently has been between architecture and interaction design, driven largely by a sort of mutual curiosity about what can VR bring to our disciplines and augmented reality bring to our disciplines. Like, these technologies really upset our notion of what these disciplines are and what these disciplines are about,
exactly,
right?
Yeah.
And you can't really do architecture with that technology without doing interaction design. And and to go into that space just with interactive technologies, you need to understand something about architecture. So you're kind of mutually dependent on each other because of the technology.
Yeah, we're in an incredible age. It's almost like the Wild West, where there's so many of these like rules that like are starting to take shape, but then are immediately broken, right? Especially when you start introducing new tools, and it's like every 6 months there's a new platform that emerges that allows you to express yourself in some way that is you've never been able to do before. Right. And it's incredibly powerful. Like thinking about VR and architecture, right? That wasn't even a thing really not too long ago. Which I think is really interesting to think from your perspective, Andrew, over at Gensler. You're building out a digital team in this traditional architecture space, and that has to be challenging, right? To bring this new component of the conversation into a large group that has been kind of doing a certain type of work for a certain amount of time. And so what are some of the challenges to that? Like how do you you know what I mean? Like crack that door and just blow it open?
That's a great question, because as I listen to Graham, I'm reminded of what it's like to work in an architecture firm. Architects are driven by this goal of creating an experience, creating useful space, almost to a fault. They do believe they're creating something bigger than a building, and yet these same architects are being asked to do it faster and faster. There's less time. The process of architecture is very traditional, and it follows a very waterfall methodology. Yet most of we design space for a lot of technology companies, which are very agile, and we have this conflict of having to make decisions early in the process that they'd like to defer those and wait to see what happens and maybe change their mind. And architecture doesn't work that way. And also there's not a great language for documenting these interactions between the physical and the digital space. UX is still young, but it's much more mature when you look at app design or website design compared to what an interaction should be in a physical space.
Absolutely. Christopher, so you're over at Ammunition, and you guys are doing, outstanding industrial design, and you're moving in digital. And what is it? So kind of going to the thought around like hybridization versus specialization, which I know has been like, an exhaustive question that's been discussed, I believe, ad nauseum, but I still really think a lot about, well, is it better to be a hybrid? Is it better to be a specialist? Is it on a case by case? Are there rules around like, how many capabilities should I really expand myself? And if that's the case, what should I celebrate? What should I advertise? Yeah. So from your perspective at Ammunition, which does such terrific industrial design, do you feel like it's for you particularly in your group to just be extremely strong in this one offering, or is it actually better to kind of, I wouldn't say dilute, but kind of expand and figure out like where other areas of opportunity are that can allow your business to grow in certain directions should you choose? I compare this to sort of like the Fuseproject model, which has like, really rich experience in all these different disciplines and celebrates that as part of their brand offering. How does Ammunition feel to that extent?
Yeah, I don't think it's actually even all that different from Fuse in many ways, right? I think when we started about 10 years ago, it was like really only industrial design practice, like a very small team at the time. And then Robert brought in 2 more partners with like a strategic and a visual design background. It was just around the time where the entire industrial design or the industry changed a little bit also, right? To that point, we have seen a lot of corporate clients also, and often you would just produce like a set of concepts that would disappear in some drawer and never see the light of day. But it was just around the time where we saw like this huge expansion into connected products also, and a lot of startups who were well funded to work with high-profile design firms also. And those startups had a need really for like a full service offering, right? Not only industrial design, but also brand identity, packaging, UI, UX, like really all aspects. And that's where we realized we really have to expand and really provide all those services to really have that level of control we like to have in the process also. So at this point, we actually have like, and it's like a multidisciplinary design team. We offer like all services other than engineering. We don't have any mechanical engineering, no software engineering. For the simple reason that that's really like experts also, and we probably wouldn't be able to keep a really talented engineer busy 24/7, and those guys are really expensive also. So it doesn't quite make sense for us, and for engineering we just partner with other consultancies that are specialized, very much specialized in engineering also, and that works really well for us. I mean, it's really, we have like long relationships with those engineering partners in the city, and it's like almost working with in-house teams also.
So when you partner with the engineering or mechanical engineering firm and you say, hey, here's the design, how it should work, et cetera, you hand that over and then you kind of trust them to figure it out. It's like you kind of, tell me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but if their job is to essentially figure out the ME or double E or other activity, there is a point where you kind of say, okay, I trust you to kind of own this space and come back with really strong results, as opposed to you leaning in or your team leaning in and kind of directing and tell them like, oh, here's actually how you should put the board together or these, other elements. So that's kind of interesting to think about, is like if you're partnering with a capability or a team that has capabilities outside of your own realm, where there is that trust where you have to say, all right, I hand this off to you, I expect that you'll come back with something that works and delivers on what I expect, without like being didactic and controlling. And that's that dichotomy that gets really interesting, is like, how much should we trust others, or should we just believe that they'll come back with the results that we want? I ask this because I think a lot about, like, in our team at Fjord, which I'll ask MJ about here, we hire hybrids and we really celebrate hybridization and this idea of just having an expansive understanding, or however cursory, of just like all the different pieces of the mechanics that are out there in the design space. In fact, we celebrate curiosity. That's one of the tenets of who we are and what we look for in our candidates, this like insatiable desire to constantly ask questions and learn. And MJ, I'll ask you if you could speak to like why we do that. Why is hybridization and this curiosity so core to our business model and the kind of teams that we build? And how does that actually affect, in your words, like the end product of what we deliver?
Yeah, I think for us on the service design side, we're kind of in a unique position of always taking that really broad connected view, because that's the heart of the design solution we're trying to deliver. So we need a team of diverse talents. You have to have deep skill sets so that you can communicate the idea and you can uncover what's needed. But if we don't have a bunch of people asking a bigger question of why, we go down a solution channel or answer too early. So service design has us looking across every touch point and connection point in the system that at the end of the day very likely might not have a physical product to it. It might not have a screen, but it's moved a bunch of information and people's thoughts and patterns in a way that transforms it and changes it. So I like to have a bit of that hybrid style talent because I think that we don't know where we're really going, and the design practice when you're on the forefront edge of finding out what's next. And I think everybody here represents from student or work side where we might be going. We don't really know. The trends we're pinpointing are really the ones that we've seen patterns from already for the year. But I was told a long while back by a mentor of mine, Red Burns, that you don't really know exactly where you're headed in terms of your career path or what you're doing business-wise of point A to point B, but there's something that you're passionate about that on the periphery sets where you're going. And for me personally, that was like a great relief because I could stop trying to think or plan about where I was going. I was never good at that anyways. But the part about bringing in passionate people that have a talent and have other interests is critical to that exploring. So craft is incredibly important, but you probably wound up in that craft first by being curious somehow, and you look for that. And that'll drive us towards what we're trying to answer.
Totally. So the question that I want to kind of pose to whoever wants to take it next is, when you have an agency or you have a large space with many different talented people who are really going into different areas, that curiosity that you just touched on, what are the challenges that we see? What are some of the conflicts that arise? Because they're there. I mean, we all work hard and fast and furious, and there's pressure, right, in all of our respective spaces. And so, you know, if we're like looking into new areas and we're trying to build out new skills or answer questions and just be curious, what are some of the challenges in your experience that we've seen from this model, as opposed to having a segmented, like, okay, you're doing this, you're doing that, and you're plugged in on these parts of the program and just kind of like follow the formula. Having this more open boundaries, sort of organic system inevitably invites, to some extent, some chaos that we have to mitigate as leaders in our area. So how do we do that? And what are some of the challenges that you've experienced along the way?
Well, I don't know about you guys, but I think it's about finding the idea that's the hardest part. Actually, I think that's really what the chaos becomes, because we don't know where the idea is going to come from. And you're in these group brainstorms, and you're working together, and you're doing research, and you're hearing what strategists are thinking about the research, and then they come back with ideas, and you're like, oh, well, that's not even where I was thinking. Mm-hmm. And I think it's hard. I'm curious what you guys have experienced, but the idea, even though sometimes it comes in as an industrial design product. Oh, hello.
There you go.
Well, there you go. Even though sometimes it comes in as an industrial design project, it sometimes goes out as an experience design solution. So I think a lot of times that's because the idea wasn't really rooted in industrial design to begin with, but we didn't know that until we started to talk. But the idea, I think, is the hardest part to find, as far as where it's coming from and who it's going to end up with, and what, not necessarily what discipline owns that, but who's going to drive that train, and how are they going to communicate all of these facets together as they work together interdisciplinary, and also communicating that story to the client. I find that's where the most chaos comes.
Yeah, I think we are not very process heavy at ammunition also, right? I think that's kind of important to keep all the different teams, all the different disciplines as integrated as possible, like in the decision-making process also. I think talking about chaos, I think it's kind of chaos for a designer. It's most frustrating for a designer if they get too prescriptive direction in a way, right? If the strategic team comes up with a framework and it kind of just gets applied to the industrial design process and kind of limits the freedom of the industrial designer and their creativity also. I think that's where it's frustrating, and with frustration you create chaos in a way, right? Mm-hmm. So I think what we are trying to do is really to start all the disciplines in parallel, really. So there's completely blue sky in that sense for industrial design for all the disciplines in a way. And then we create those check-in points, right, where we all come together and talk about our ideas and thoughts and discuss them and make sure we have like those alignment points in a way. And that's like really the point where we kind of check in on or like we really reflect on our own ideas also. And through the discussion, we make decisions again, right? And everybody is part of the decision. And I think that's the important part, right? If you understand how we get to a certain decision and how we move forward, and you really have that ownership also in the process, that's where you kind of keep things kind of controlled and structured also.
So it somewhat anchors on these, well, an understanding of roles and responsibilities, but certainly like this element of trust, right? Certainly within the organization, which is what we've been talking about up to this point, is like this interdisciplinary collaboration within the one agency space or within a collection of folks collaborating on a project. Where I think it gets a little interesting, or more interesting perhaps, is when we start working across agencies, right? With people we don't know or that we might just not really have a relationship with. When we talk about designing beyond the screen, through my definition, that's kind of looking at ecosystems. And this is a space that we are all moving into together. We have customers, users out there who are really looking for products and services to just go beyond where the traditional expectations have been. And at Fjord, we call this living services, which is a really powerful notion. And when we look at like a product or a service, going beyond like what it's traditionally been defined to be, the expectations being traditionally defined, what I look at is, well, if some firm is doing really strong industrial design around a product or a wearable, and that wearable needs to work really well in a space. So there's an architectural physical dimension component, and yet that wearable as well also needs to talk to a companion app or a screen-based experience. We see this time and time again, I believe, where a company puts out a product or a suite of products, and they feel almost like they're just disparate parts of this like coddled together system and don't really holistically work together or feel as one. And that's a huge disservice, not just to the organization who's putting that ecosystem out, but certainly to the end user who expects everything to seamlessly fit together and have like a brand thread, right, that run throughout. And I know Kristine, as director of brand of Fuseproject, you think a lot about this on all the different touch points, from packaging to the product itself and to the digital experience.
I dream about it.
You dream about it.
Nightmares about it.
Right, like is the story cohesive throughout all these touch points? And that folds, of course, into the advertising and the messaging that goes out in advance of the product launch. And so when we look at partnering with agencies who might be anchored in an area of expertise that's outside of our particular realm, how do we build that trust and that transparency to say, hey, you know, just like we were saying earlier, the strategists are early on, or whoever's ideas can come from anywhere. But it's really easy to, or it's not easy, but it's easier to do internally as a studio, as a team, where you've got those relationships in place. Much harder, I will argue, to do with a firm that got hired as a contract vendor by the client that's sitting above. And so how do we build those bridges? How do we facilitate that transparency and work better with our partners on these really big multi-agency engagements to have enormous reach, I will argue, at the end of the day?
Yeah, I mean, that's an excellent question, and I think on a project-to-project basis, we're still trying to tackle it. Depending on who the client is and depending on who the partners are, it's it's a difficult scenario because you're working across a wide array of talented people, and they all have really good opinions, and they're all coming from a place of wanting to get their idea or their mark out in the world, whether it's from, I would say, a brand point of view, or whether it's from the product's point of view, or even the client's point of view. It really depends on who and what partner you're working with. And I think to go back to how do you solve that, I really think it comes down to your relationship with the client and how you formalize or how you can introduce your partnership in the beginning. And for me, I think it's really important to, if it's possible, which it's not always possible, but when you're working with a client and you understand that there's going to be multiple partners that you're going to be interacting with, trying to get that understanding and that foundation built together in the beginning, that's going to be your best outcome, I believe, or at least in my experience, to know who's playing what role and understand that it's not a land grab. You're not out there to be like, I want to take this from you. I think if the client is accepting in the way where they can set out who's in charge of what area, then you can actually prioritize how you're going to interact with each other. And if you can have that understanding, then I think the outputs will be that much more rich, because it's not about who did what or whose idea is best. It's about how can we make this thing great for this client together. Exactly. And it's really about that collaboration. And if you're all in it and you all have skin in the game and you're all really excited, then it doesn't really matter at the end of the day. It's all about the idea, and it's all about the clients, getting their idea out there and their product in the world. So it's a tough challenge. I think we face it almost in every single project that we work on. And I don't really know what the solution is, but I'm trying to figure it out.
When you figure it out, I'd like to know
I'll call
also.
you.
I'll
totally call you.
For us at Gensler, it's a really unique challenge, because at the end of the day, our product is construction drawings, and it's someone else's role to bring that to life. In the past, Gensler served as the top of the pyramid, really explaining or communicating to everyone beneath that, including the general contractor, what the vision was. But I think today and in the future, that experience is so multi-dimensional that it requires partnerships, and it requires a change in philosophy on what a relationship's like with a client. I've worked with some great clients that forced teams to come together and forced workshops to kick off a project where either they dictated who would be working on the project, or one of the firms involved was the lead and they brought everyone in. And those projects turned out a lot better than the ones where it was one company trying to sub out everything. We see that general contractors are trying to do a very tactical thing, hang drywall on the wall, and they're trying to finish by a deadline, and they need to buy in as well as the people doing the design too.
Absolutely, for sure.
I was going to add, I think one thing that glues it together that's been kind of fortunate lately is that people taking a more human stance and impact stance around what their product or service might be. I know that I've been challenged and asked more in the last couple years by people we're working with and products of like, well, so what's the vision statement really about, and what are the pillars, and are those our design principles, and then when do those happen? And this is coming from the owner side on the product end, where they want that piece and they want to have that through line of where they're going. And that's the one that if you get it defined, other agencies can come in and adopt that. There is some work that we're doing with a really large hospitality client right now that's got it's one of the biggest programs I've ever been on with all the different agencies, but it's super clear as to what the human impact side is supposed to be. And I know that anyone running around on this 300-person program could recite, what those brand principles are, because it's been kind of our experience principles, because that's really kind of been drilled into them with what they're delivering. And that's the only glue that there really is when we have all of these areas of expertise and complex systems and everything else. How can we all still ladder into something that has meaning for the consumer?
In that case, what agency, what group designed those experience principles? Was it the client coming in and saying, hey, all my subcontractors, these are the kind of rules of the game? Or was there a lead team that kind of helped shape that? Or was that a multi-agency effort to define those experience principles?
I think it can go both ways, just speaking to it in general, but whoever gets there first,
Sure.
Land grab.
That's right. Grab those design principles. This is the note to take away. Grab those design principles first, if you want to live by ones you like. No, I think it's incredibly important to get those set, and we've seen them come from clients with a vision. We do work now with products and people who are. We have so many new companies and businesses. It's no longer about transforming and redirecting the legacy company. A lot of times we're picking up and working alongside with digitally native companies who are inventing themselves, off of data and everything by the minute. So, yeah, it can come from either side, but incredibly important that they get carried through and they get reiterated and they get communicated on through to teams and on into everyday work.
On our daily calls, we have a safety minute where we talk about everybody wearing a yellow vest and safety goggles. Maybe we should have a mission minute also and make sure everybody knows what the mission is.
Yeah.
I like that.
Do you feel like in your experience when those experience guidelines are established, do they truly stay true throughout the program, or are they challenged throughout, or do they shape and kind of get tuned and optimized, or how static really are those experience principles in your experience?
Well, they're usually open-ended enough that there's some room for interpretation.
Right.
But to get back to a question that we kind of went over quickly that I wanted to add something to, which was the biggest challenges that it ties into is I think that we're over-indexed on being able to answer screen-based challenges, and that we've invested in school departments and programs and software tools and prototyping tools and posting and socializing tools and everything around the screen that we're asked to really rush to and answer too quickly on things in that world. Mm-hmm. So the thing that's a challenge when are the principles too rigid or do they have enough open ending? I feel like there's an assumption along the way that we are designing a screened experience in so many ways from the beginning. That's the new property that so many people own in one form or another, even if it's the physical space like you're saying. Well, that's the physical space, but then what are we doing with these screens? Where is that going? Or we've got the screens and it's like it happens to be, in a physical space, but the speed that we're supposed to go in on that is crazy. So the thing with the principles, if they work well, they shouldn't dictate that it's some kind of screen-based experience, or if you have one and it's the way that your head is going and your team is going, stop and really try to challenge that and see if that's the right answer and way that we're going. I know you and I have been on stuff where we've been we know we're headed down this path, but I think actually you can do a kind of zero UI moment here and still achieve the same thing. But do we have the buy-in from who we're working for to be hey, why don't you stop down all those developers that you got ready, for that platform, and we'll stop kind of marketing this kind of release because we're going to bring it together on a different form factor. And that's something that's a huge challenge for us right now in this one of designing beyond the screen is a must, but designing beyond the screen is incredibly hard right now to get people to trust us to follow through and experiment a little bit farther.
Absolutely. I think one thing that, Graham, you had mentioned in some of our email exchanges is that there's almost this default behavior of let's just slap a screen on it, right? Or design for a screen kind of out of the gate, because that's somewhat of the de facto touch point that we've experienced for so long. And to MJ's point, it's we really need to challenge our clients and even ourselves to think literally beyond it and look at, well, what can we use as an input or even an output in lieu of the screen that actually could really maybe be a little bit more of an investment to explore and design against, but ultimately down the road pay just enormous dividends than had we gone the traditional screen approach.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as someone who's gone from the industry, still got a foot in the industry, now in education, and I think back to my own experience in school, and what were we looking at in school 20 years ago now, and how has things panned out? And back then it was the topic was convergence, that all of these devices would fall into one. We didn't quite envision the app market, but it's arrived as a consequence. And with students, I think that they want to be designing the future that is going to take us beyond where we are now, beyond the screen-based interface. And the challenge is partly the tools that we have for designing screen-based interfaces are that much further ahead than we have for the tools for designing non-screen-based interfaces. There's a much steeper learning curve for coding Arduino, for example, than there is for creating a screen-based interface. And what I think sometimes get missed is that these tools are they kind of already encapsulate patterns of interaction that we take for granted. And it's almost like we jump ahead of ourselves in terms of thinking about what is possible, because as things get easier to design and easier to engineer, we almost embody these assumptions in the code that we're using to then create this new generation. So for me, I think it's super exciting to be able to move between these different spaces, and the students should. I'm really excited to see our students like moving between all of these different tool sets. Yeah.
And you have a class, I believe it's called Objects in Space. Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's called Objects and Spaces. I've never been quite sure, but yeah.
And so we've had a number, because you just have such an incredible program at CCA, and we're lucky to have two amazing interns with us this summer, both of which are your students in an interaction design program at CCA. And we've had no shortage of folks come through the studio and share work, and a lot of it has been showcased by the stuff that you've been doing in your Objects in Space class, and it's been kind of wild to see. It's been really incredible, some of the work that's been shared.
You mean the dildo harp?
Yeah, that's one example. And so, which is a great project.
That was part of our tangible musical instruments class.
Do you want to talk? Yeah, I was going to say, I mean, if you wanted to, I was going to ask you kind of what was some of the thinking behind the design of that class, of the object in spaces or the tangible, because you sit.
What was the thinking?
It's really incredible. The output is just terrific, because it's just kind of like, really inspiring stuff that I'm seeing these students do.
I mean, I guess there were two goals. One was to sort of get students skilled up in what it takes to build physical things that move, and to sequence those. So there's a chap here, Trip, who was awesome in helping us make that happen as well. So, but then there's like, once you have this like tool set, and we sort of helped set the students up by building this tool set, it's only then that you can sort of find out by playing as to what is really possible once you have that kit of parts, right? And so that to me is like when the really creative stuff begins to happen. It's like that's when you get the dildo harp, right? Sure. So I don't know if I should explain it, but maybe I should now I brought it up, right?
Just go ahead and Google that on your own time.
I'm wondering, it's a great one to just search. Just type it in and search.
You won't be disappointed.
It has an extraordinary mechanical movement to it. That's all
it really is quite an incredible project. But so what I'm hearing is that you kind of create this environment and this program of your classes that really celebrates play and experimentation and maybe the invention of new tools.
Yeah.
All right, to sort of facilitate this level of expression and see where you net out. And that's really what college kind of traditionally is for, right?
Right.
But how do we maybe take some of that and bring it into the agency space? Like I know houses, like we have our make shop in San Francisco here and in New York, and and a lot of teams will have prototyping labs to sort of explore this stuff. And what's interesting is like how do we start to get that conversation into the mind of the client? Because obviously, of course, they have to pay for all these activities, but the output of that can be incredibly rich and has enormous potential if we somewhat have permission to play.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think that the thing that makes a big difference at CCA is that Intel very generously sponsored a lab that we have. It's called the Hybrid Lab, and it's basically this room in which anyone can go in. You don't need to be studying technology, it could be fashion or anything, and you can just turn up in a very relaxed manner and pull out a drawer, you find an Arduino, and someone there will help you straight away, like figure out how to plug it in and get things happening. So we have this kind of culture of prototyping that is very accessible, deliberately accessible. And we provide like a support network. So there are hybrid lab monitors who are there almost 24/7, they're always there. But they're there to help facilitate this engagement with the technology. And it's there actually in the spaces that these collaborations kind of happen accidentally, right? It's almost through proximity that you can be working on your project, I'm working on mine, and something happens. So there's something about the architecture and like just having these open spaces that enables that too.
And it sounds like, if I'm hearing correctly, you almost have like these resident experts who might be really strong in a particular technology or tool. So if I was curious about X and I wanted to kind of dabble into it, I know with confidence that there's someone in the class or within, a stone's throw that can help me kind of figure out whatever bump I might hit in my journey.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's, as opposed to like falling flat on my face and feeling disappointed and having to scrap all that time away. Yeah. So it's almost fail safe. And I think within Fjord, we've got some really interesting stuff that we've been experimenting with around VR, and it's all pretty up for display throughout the studio. So I'll walk down the hall or to the other area of the studio and I'll see someone doing some really amazing work with virtual reality or another different tool or medium, and there's nothing to stop me from going over and oh, what's going on over there? And then there's an eagerness to kind of share and help invite us in to learn more about it and kind of give us the sort of empowerment to kind of explore that space, permission, if you will. And I keep laddering this back up to the agency or interagency level because we seem, from my perspective throughout my career, the multi-agency experience has been this siloed kind of this is my corner of the sandbox, these little mini fiefdoms, and everybody's kind of vying to protect their little silos, so to speak. And I really want to see how we can eventually break down those walls and have that level of transparency and that level of empathy and that level of trust and that level of hey, partner agency, we're doing this, and yeah, help us out and we'll help you out. I mean, I know I'm kind of talking about this utopian world which may never ever take shape, but it's I don't know.
I'd like to go there.
You'd like to go there? I think we'd all like to go there.
Yeah, but it's much more, it makes sense. And there should be bigger physical spaces, both within agencies and within client sites and elsewhere. And if you go down to Facebook now and you look at their center for just making, and the access they've got is unbelievable. You know? And same with over at Google. The thread that you were just talking about is really interesting because it reminds me of a trip that I made over to UC Berkeley recently too, where they also had an innovation center lab, but it didn't have to do with people who were necessarily in a design degree program. You could be in anything. You could be in the education program, but you have an idea, and you go to the innovation lab area where you can prototype, make, and learn. So I think because it's physical, because it involves a space, we have to start making room for those to invite people in to understand. So the side that you're talking about with clients being comfortable with it or having room to take the risk, you can't just design it on the screen and show it on a screen on the other side and them see and understand what your idea is. You have to kind of show up and experiment and play a bit. So if we can expand some of those kinds of creative spaces to be involved in, then I think it's an easier way to go through it. There's no way to really review the work. Or participate without physically being a part of it.
Exactly.
Sorry. It seems like just events like today already help to break down some of those walls also, right? And I'm actually really excited to hear about those things you're doing also with your students at CCA. Sure, in industrial design, product development, it's always very much driven by, on the one hand, schedule and cost, obviously. The experimentation usually is more expensive, takes longer, and it's risky also, and there's a good chance it might not lead to a successful idea or product, right? But I think to know about those opportunities early on, that we are aware of those opportunities and we can actually introduce them to the process early on, saves time, and ideally we understand potential cost implications also. I think that really helps to potentially enable new technologies also. And I think just in generally designing beyond the screen, I think in industrial design we're actually seeing generally a tendency to move away from screens also, right? We always, when we work on stuff and we just assume there's a screen, one of the first questions is, do we need that screen, right? Followed by, do we need that button to really make things, clean things up, make things as simple as possible. And I think, over the last years, with just new, interactive technologies also, right? Talking about voice control, gesture control, and all those things, it really allows for completely new approaches to interactions also. There's obviously complex products, complex interactions that always require a screen. You just can't establish those through a simplified interface. But I think generally, if there's an opportunity to move away from a screen and allow for more innovative approaches to interactions, it usually also allows for more interesting, more inspirational interactions in a way that allow for more imagination also in products that are less prescriptive than a screen.
I wanted to come back to the collaboration part for just a moment, because this is one area where architecture actually makes it work. But if we put it in the context of generalists versus specialists, it works because most of the people on a project are specialists, and there's very little risk or fear of those people coming into your space. So on the San Francisco Airport project, there's a hangar that's been turned into an office space. They call it the big room, and there's 15 or 20 different firms that all work together in this space, and they all have. It's like the United Nations. There's signs that hang above groups of desks that say what company they're with, and there's no territorial boundaries. There's no jealousy or any sort of harsh feelings, because everybody's scope was well defined, because they're all very specialized. There are very few generalists. And unfortunately, the only way that all comes together is after the scope of work is awarded. It's a shame that we can't move that up and have that be part of the initial concept.
Yeah, absolutely. I completely agree. So let's shift gears a little bit and maybe talk about something, well, I don't know if this is more tangible, but it's something that I'm particularly interested in. I think we all heard in last few days about Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods. I think this is really, really interesting. I think you've all by now have seen the video on their website of Amazon Go, this like magical retail experience where you literally just walk in and grab what you want off the shelf and walk out. And I believe it's still in this beta phase and hasn't actually rolled out yet, but it's supposed to be coming this year. And through the acquisition of Whole Foods, I'd imagine that they're going to take Whole Foods, retail spaces and literally just transform what we expect today or what we experience today of. Again, the grabbing of things and the shopping in the physical space. And so Amazon has, of course, started as a bookstore, and then they moved into the screen-based experience that we're so familiar with online shopping and mobile. And now as they move into this physical domain, using all these various components of technology to facilitate this arguably next level experience, it's really interesting to think about, well, how did they achieve that? How did they partner? Did they do that all in-house? Did they work with other vendors? Like, what was the shaping of the conversation that must have played out to get them to a place where they can reinvent what is the grocery store experience? Because you really, I think, as I understand it from the videos I've seen, you just scan your phone when you walk in, or maybe you just have it on your body as you move through the turnstile, but then that's really it. You're not looking at any other screens throughout the entire experience of shopping, but yet it's intended to be incredibly accurate, and off you go with everything that you've purchased without having to actually interact with really anyone through the traditional checkout space. So we'll see how that plays out, of course, when it's available to all of us, and hopefully it's successful, because I think it's really imaginative. But what I'm curious about is, like, how can we as designers get into a similar situation where we're designing really like a completely new definition of what has been a traditional experience, be it in retail or hospitality or dining or medical, because those opportunities are there. And it takes thinking like this, of going beyond the screen and really shaping or redefining this interdisciplinary collaboration and trust models to allow for these higher level experiences to take shape, I believe. So anyway, I just want to offer any thoughts to that, like when you think about Amazon Go, or perhaps there's even other examples that you could think of, how might we get there?
I'm kind of scared of the future.
Yeah.
Like, I think that you mentioned, like in my little intro, like we think about the way the future could be, and sometimes we sort of veer a bit towards the sort of Black Mirror side of things as we imagine that future, right? And so you talk about like a seamless, connected experience, right? For a purely beautifully seamless connected experience, it seems to me, I may be wrong, but you have to give up a certain amount of control as a consumer as you're moving through space, all right? And so maybe that means there are cameras watching you. Right. And we're kind of at a point now where almost we can recognize someone's identity by the way in which they move their body. Right. Right? So I think I didn't realize this till the other day, but every Kinect camera that is plugged in right now that kids are playing games in front of is also building up a sort of profile of that person and is building up a sort of database of humanity, right? So eventually, I mean, it's basically a form of IP, right? Right. It's sure. My gait is now a form of identity, the way I move. It's your fingerprint. Yeah, it's a fingerprint. Recognized without you actually touching anything. Right. Yeah. And so, so if we are to have this like beautifully seamless experience in which where we can go into the store and sort of shoplift legally, almost, and walk out the door, right? What do we have to give up in order for that to happen? So what's interesting about like working within the space of education is how what we speculate on how that may be something we don't necessarily want, and that information may be used against us at some point. And so I think there's great potential, but I'm a bit
There's always a
afraid.
trade-off.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just going to echo that because I'm with you. I'm scared of the future.
Okay.
But in the way where I think it's more on the tactility level where, are we going to lose a lot of authenticity? Are we going to lose authenticity of ourselves? And, by going through these environments that are planned out for you and anticipating your every need and your every want, how is it going to know when I just switch and want to change my mind? And is it going to be able to plan for that? And I know these are really wide, unanswered questions, but do I want it to plan for that? I don't know if I want something to engage with me that deeply where it could understand my sharp, maybe awkward reaction to something and then change my mind. And I think that if something can know me that well, then how do I even know myself? And then if they know me that well, then what's from me stopping me to engage with other people? So I think that there's a very fine line that we have to remember when we're designing for these types of experiences, is that, whether it's building in that human relationship or finding that core where people actually still get to interact with each other. I know that the movie WALL-E is constantly referenced as far as, this is what the future may hold, but I don't find it to be that far off.
Yeah, it's like the race to the singularity is
Completely.
just speeding up.
I mean, I already find this to be a very, solo stage where people are walking through and creating all of these apps where you're by yourself and it's swipe left, I don't care. And it becomes very gamified.
Right.
And I think these types of experiences, it's become so easy to shop and so easy to buy and so easy to not really think about the consequences or the people behind the product or even who's serving up the product, that it really takes the humanity out of it. So I'm also curious to see what Amazon and Whole Foods have in store so that we, don't lose touch with that tactility.
Well, sure. I mean, you go shopping and you run into a friend,
Totally.
right? And there's always those human moments that have been
That never
around.
happens anymore.
Right, because people now walk around
I know.
to Whole Foods with their phone out, like
Well,
looking
I
at their
get
groceries.
boxes from Amazon now. Why would I go
why do you even go
shopping?
shopping? Yeah. No, go ahead.
No, that's it.
I think that's part of the interesting dichotomy of the Amazon Whole Foods merger, because there's a culture of working at Whole Foods, and the people want to go to work there, and they want to be part of your life and provide you with something wholesome. And the Amazon one-click, instant gratification is kind of on the other end of that spectrum.
It's an amazing design challenge. I mean,
Absolutely.
when you think about their partnership and what they have to actually solve, bringing humanity to a digital space where they want to be able to serve you anything at any time, but still remain wholesome.
Right.
It's tough.
It's not virtual foods.
No, it's not virtual foods.
No, and if history shows us anything, to show us that if it provides enough utility, then we'll be happy with it.
Yeah, completely.
Hi.
Hey.
Some trade secrets there. I had to make sure I captured. Sorry.
And I think maybe just to follow up to this, those concerns also. It seems like eventually it's hard to tell how to address that future also, right? It definitely seems to be a matter of education often also, that people are aware of how to interact with all those different sources of information and how to make choices. it seems like, I mean, all those like developments, right, create always those counter movements also. Like on the one hand, there's Amazon All Click, on the other hand, there's like urban farming and all those things, right, where people really want to be in full control of their process and where everything comes from. And it's like really creating those really strong extremes right there again. And there's all those people who are aware, who have the choice, who takes the choice, and then other people who are not aware and who kind of just follow the stream of convenience. And so, and it really creates like a, kind of that social gap in a way also that we are seeing in many aspects of life. And how to bridge that, I think that's the biggest challenge really, and I think a lot comes with education and awareness also.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, going back to what Graham and Kristine have also mentioned, it is quite terrifying when you think about, we had such a huge, the mobile revolution has changed our lives in so many ways. It's hard to even get to that, right? And you think about, well, of course, we've got everything at our fingertips now and all this amazing information, but yet it's changed our behaviors as people all around the world. And we're always looking at our phones and we're wandering around Whole Foods, everything's this, or we're sitting at the bus stop. And I saw somebody the other day like flipping a quarter at the bus stop while I was waiting for the bus while everybody was sitting on their phones. And I was just like kind of looking at them and I'm like, I never see that anymore. Like nobody sits there flipping a quarter at a bus stop.
How strange.
Right? We're all sitting there like doing this. And
Only if it's on a screen. Then it can be flipped.
on the street, just not a care in the world, flipping a quarter.
There.
I was like, right on, that's pretty cool.
How novel.
How novel, right? Yeah, but of course, 10 years ago, nobody would think twice about that, given where we are today. And so as we look at whatever the AI or the technology is, or the new design paradigms that enable this seamless moving through retail or whatever it is next, and I don't know that we have an answer to this, is how do we preserve the integrity of our humanity so it doesn't just absolutely get consumed by these services and these solutions that are supposed to save us, potentially from ourselves?
Yeah, this reminds me of a project from back in my school days, but a guy called Chris Downs who created a service design company called Live Work in London. One of his projects was called Loom, and he did this amazing experiment. There was a point at which the British government made it every citizen's right to ask for every piece of digital information that your banking, your banks own on you, and he got back this giant stack of paper. It was incredible. We didn't realize that there was that much information. And his concept was, it was called Loom, and the concept was that you would become the personal broker of your information. So you became the trader, and so you would sell it on to services in order that it was like a transaction basically between you and them. And it seems like if you had that power as a consumer to own the information that was about you, then there might at least be the hope then that it might be used for your benefit.
Yeah.
I don't know where you take
We
that.
could talk about
It's
this
very
forever. Yeah. I mean, it almost kind of starts in my mind to ask the question of how well does one know thyself, right? And so if we are leaning on technology or our companies to help define us and curate all of this content for us based on what they think we are, then it's like that. It starts to get a little blurry, right? And you start to your point earlier, things start to evaporate until you start to maybe lose a sense of who you are as a core.
Yeah.
And perhaps if we can be proactive and define that and actually feed the right curated information back to the technology, then we actually get something that's in service of us and not diminishing.
I think that's the verb, being proactive.
Yeah, there you go. So we're at 8:30. And I want to certainly leave time for us all to have another refreshment and wander around and chat. But I want to give everyone an opportunity, if you had any closing thoughts or anything that you felt was outstanding that we hadn't touched on tonight before we close.
No, we just landed on something really simple like identity management, and it got real simple here in the end. So,
sorry to bring it down.
Sorry to dig the hole really deep.
Yeah. No, it's huge. I think it's an interesting thing that we bring up. It's just rounding back to where we started, which was about creative teams and how we answer problems and that kind of thing. If we need to be rounded out better with ethicists and behaviorists, we need to think a lot farther and deeper with what we do because we create these small pieces that are totally connected. So our whole trends piece that we talked about with the unintended consequences. It snuck in there just right at the right time this year as we were looking at where we were headed and what we need to think about. But these things beyond the screen, you know, for what it's worth, the way we've come through so far, we've created a lot of things that give people individual personal control over something that they have in their pocket. And the greatest irritant might be still the passcode entry and passwords, but give it up. And we really do have, you know, a lot more to think about as we release some of these things, you know, into the world. So
I wonder if down the road we'll start to see like psychologists and behaviorists coming into the interdisciplinary agency space beyond just graphic designers and these.
Yeah, I mean they have classically been there in the planning when it's just about trying to, you know, position some product in the past and getting an edge, and now maybe it's not about just the positioning and market size, but it's actually more predicting impact and consequences and other things. It's the same practice, but it's like we can't ignore that impact that can happen.
Absolutely.
Yeah, maybe an industrial designer see an opportunity in just being very disciplined about the products we develop also, right? I think, like earlier I talked how like you question when you develop a product if you need a screen, and you question if you need a button. The third question you would ask always is, do you need an app? It's always like that easy escape into an app also. And most of you don't need an app, then we need a button and vice versa, but that's another problem. But I think, being disciplined means that you don't actually, that you avoid like technology overload, right? That you create an experience that's very focused on one single purpose. Doesn't mean that there's still some data gathering in the background, etc., but it really feeds like one very focused purpose in your life. And that's where you can really create products that are more show the discipline and are more inspirational also, not trying to do everything, but really fulfill one very particular purpose.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Kristine, I know you got something else in there waiting to come out.
You just knew I had something to say. I mean, the overall idea is to simplify. And I think that no matter what you're creating, to be able to create a more simple experience to make that easier and more enjoyable. And a lot of times that doesn't need me to be like this to do it. So finding a way to integrate that but still have that feeling of joy when you're using said thing or looking at said product or, you know, talking with your friends. It doesn't really matter what it is. I think it's just making it a more simple experience and, you know, asking like the deeper question of, do we really need to include this?
Right.
And is it just because they've asked us to, or is it because it's right? And a lot of that also comes down to sustainability and realizing I think it's our job as designers to think about what it is that we're making and what it is that we're producing and where that's going to go once it's thrown out.
Right.
Once it's not necessary anymore, especially with this, with, you know, all of the tools and all of the gadgets that we use now, they're so cheap and they're so easy and there's so many of them, and, you know, that's in surplus so that we can create and experiment. But when we're creating and experimenting, we should be mindful about where that experiment goes when it's not necessary anymore. Mm-hmm. And what are people holding and what are they using and how long will they actually use it? And I think that we're, you know, very much in a society of, you know, quantity over quality still.
Absolutely.
And, you know, things do cycle through where, you know, people are going back to canning and, like you guys were saying earlier, you know, holistic farming and, you know, where is my cow raised type of mentality,
right.
Because they're craving this authenticity and they're craving this, you know, feeling of, you know, going backwards. Mm-hmm. Yet it's so hard because we're going forward so fast. So I think ultimately we just need to remember to think about what it is we're producing and simplify that, because it will have an end life, and wherever that goes, we're responsible for it.
Absolutely.
Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask a question. So I'm Steve. Yeah. So you guys know. Hey. So
Hi, Steve.
Hi. So what I'd really like to understand is, I think all of us deal with this problem in every single one of our careers, where we're trying to convince people why it's important to think about this. Because most of the time we get very discrete asks that are, hey, design this screen for me. And I see it at Fjord, I've seen it in other roles that I've had. Like, how do we convince the people that we're designing for that this is important to think about? And I think I put that question to all of you on the panel, because I don't think we have an answer there yet, and I'd like to hear more about what you think about that. How do we push the people we're serving to think beyond the screen?
Yeah.
And sorry for the intrusion.
I like the intrusion, and I think it comes. I think that MJ said something earlier that can be at the root of that, and that's what is the human benefit of what we're doing. I know personally we don't ask our clients that enough, and we should. It's really easy to drag widgets onto a screen to do a rapid prototype, but there's not a toolbox of human benefits you can drag into a document that describes what the end experience should be. And we move so fast, at least in our industry. Everybody wants their building. The building's going to take 2 or 3 years to finish, or a big box store is going to take 18 months to finish, but they want it 6 months earlier. So we don't stop to ask those questions. We rush to a design. And if we ask that question more frequently, and we establish that, and we make sure everybody on the team understands that, we might get a little closer to it. I'm not sure we'll get entirely there, but that'll help.
That kind of question, I guess, assumes that they've already decided that they want an app. And so my response would be to sort of backtrack and sort of delve into their motivations as to what they really want to get, whether it's what their educational goals or brand message goals, for example. The scary part about that, though, is if you're an app designer, you may lose the job, right? You're kind of turning it away. And so if it means you are sort of trapped by your own limited range of skills and aren't a great collaborator, then maybe you don't ask those questions. But to be honest, I always found like it's been that's the more interesting question to ask, is about people's motivations, and unravel it backwards, and then together like come towards the design brief together. But just in general, sort of rounding up about collaboration, like for me, like the best collaborative experiences have been ones in which I've gone in with an open mind and willing to learn something from my collaborator, right? And yes, it requires trust, and I like a never-ending like redressing of what the responsibilities are,
right,
as well, because that's always shifting. And I see this with students too, right? It's like collaboration is a real skill, and it takes practice, and sometimes it works, and sometimes it goes horribly wrong, right? To be honest, but it's from all of those experiences. I see students who like end up doing amazing work because suddenly they found someone who like really brings out something special in them that they didn't know that they had inside themselves already. All right, and that to me is like, yeah, that's the killer collaboration. Yeah.
And I think I'll just add to that, I think part of that is also just like that being transparent, that like sharing like, hey, I'm really excited about this, and people will come forth because I think naturally, inherently as humans, we want to help other people. If we are skilled at something and we find that somebody is interested in an area, like we will, generally speaking, rise to the occasion to assist, because there's so much to benefit from that. The knowledge sharing, the rapport, the relationship that can ultimately come from that, especially in a safe setting like a classroom. And I personally would love to see that happen more in the interagency and the more professional space model. So I will, I think, end at this unless anyone has anything they also want to add. I know there's probably a lot of burning questions in this audience.
Hello? Can I just ask a quick question?
Yeah.
It's, having been someone who went to CCA, and back in the day, a long time ago, it was a very graphic-orientated, print-based medium, but what is designing beyond the screen, really? Like, how can we really implement it into places like Best Buy, into new skyscrapers, and really get our heads around what design is beyond the screen, because I'm a visual designer from trade, but I would love to really know what my future is as a visual designer, where we're talking about voice and facial recognition and really going beyond the screen. It would be interesting to hear what the 5 panelists really have to say about that and their points of view. Thanks.
We talk about it a lot in retail design and hospitality, and it is a challenge because there isn't a way to document a lot. I mean, we can write a Word document, we write a narrative, but all the designers in our architecture studios and our interior design studios, they're very visual people. And I think one of the reasons that it hasn't moved further faster is that it's hard for a lot of people to get their heads around. You know, the amount of predictive technology that's available when you walk into that Best Buy store, if you're recognized, I mean, you should be able to get a much more tailored custom experience. In that case, maybe it's designing for someone else's screen instead of your screen until we get to an interface that's one-to-one to you. But your question is great. I wish we could, we haven't figured out any way to solve it inside our industry, because in architecture, you become a knowledgeable architect and interior designer with experience. A lot of the learning comes from practical work, and so the people who are doing the work on our jobs day to day, they haven't grown up with this technology, and the ones that have grown up with the technology and are ready to adapt it don't know how to apply it yet. We're kind of at this point where two things need to catch up. I think it's a great question. We're trying to solve it every day, and I'm hoping maybe somebody else has some ideas too.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of it is the stuff we touched on earlier of moving into different tool sets and how we apply it. We're always going to have a read in terms of a visual language and understanding things and how those can be communicated, and that's such a power in the traditional, graphic design practice. And I've started to see, as I've gone around and looked at work of people coming out of programs, some incredibly interesting work. If you go to a program and I'm looking for more of an interaction designer or something in the digital space, and you go to the graphic design department, and the work is incredible because of the spaces that they're pushing them into to explore it. So visually, that language and art and craft is so strong, and then how that gets projected into learning the dimensions of space and starting to work in different tools and map those 3D environments and look for other ways that whatever that natural kind of talent and instinct and the hours and hours of training that have gone into those details, there's a whole new palette, to work with basically within it is where I see that playing out.
Yeah, I think it goes back to the earlier point around helping our clients understand. I think to Steve's question, why is it important? Why is it important to ask these questions? Why is it important to experiment and play and challenge our processes and explore new dialogues and bring more people into the fold to really explore what are the new interaction modes and models that we don't even know about yet? Because it's important to go there, because some of the elements that we have today just simply aren't working. To your question, Gordon, and I'm sure other people are thinking the same around touch points that they've had experiences with, that this is like terrible, it could be so much better. So it's hard, right? It's hard to ask the important questions, especially when you've got a tight timeline or maybe an aggressive client or a challenging collaboration to boot, but we have to do it because it's ultimately the effort and the investment is all in service to the end user, and that's what we're here to do. To provide this, high quality design that, does make the world a better, safer, more humanistic place. So with that, I want to let everybody kind of get back together and chat. Okay. I know there's a lot of thoughts, hopefully, in your heads that you want to share with our panelists. So on that, I want to just thank all of you for your time tonight and coming and participating. It's been an honor to sit alongside you and hear your thoughts on this, I think, very provocative discussion. So please, everyone, give a huge, warm round of applause for these amazing panelists.